Howdy folks, if you're watching this on Monday as an episode of Mingles with Jingles, welcome to the latest episode of Mingles with Jingles. And if you're here live, one of the 70 audience members, hopefully 71, there's more sneaking in, welcome to the monthly Q&A for June. Now this was supposed to happen last weekend, because it's always the first weekend in any given month, but well, I'm sure most of you are aware of what's just happened to Eddie, so I'll start off with a quick update. So as I'm sure you're all aware, Eddie was diagnosed with terminal bowel cancer, so he's in hospital. He's still in hospital. The initial news was really, really bad because it's terminal bowel cancer. The tumour's too big for them to operate on, and they told him if they did nothing, he'd be dead in 3 months. However, the news is now slightly more hopeful because he's only 43. He's still relatively young and he's strong. So they're going to start him on a very aggressive course of chemotherapy, which will hopefully shrink the tumour down to a size where they can actually operate on it and cure him. But at the very least, he's going to have years rather than months. So that's the good news. The not so good news is that he was due to have a stomach bypass surgery this week, so that he can actually feed himself and go home. And for some reason, not entirely clear why, they cancelled the surgery at the last moment, which he wasn't best pleased about because he'd been on nil by mouth, so he hadn't eaten anything or drunk anything in like 10 hours, and then they cancelled the surgery on him. So his dad brought him a curry, which he was very happy about. And now we're just waiting, basically, for him to get this stomach bypass and be able to come home. Because he's been in that hospital 2 weeks now, and he's really not enjoying it. I took him my Nintendo Switch handheld, a bunch of games on it, Monster High, a bunch of pinball games, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, to keep him occupied. And he's got plenty of visitors, so fingers crossed. I know you all love him as much as I do, and I'll keep you updated on the situation as and when stuff happens. But for now, and yes, I am recording, I actually have the correct microphone, and it is turned on. We checked all of this before we started. Well, let's crack on with the questions. So, over to the questions for Jingles channel. The first question's from Basement Jesus. Dear Overlord, the suggestion box in the mines has been overflowing with requests for more paid time off. Wait, what? And for the overpriced, barely working vending machines in the break room to be fixed. Some of the vending machine suggestions come with threats of mutiny if not fixed. What are your answers to these? You know I'm an evil Overlord, right? I mean, you're not paid. You have to purchase and maintain your own tools. Don't you watch those Mighty Jingles videos I put up every Christmas? Although I didn't do one this year, did I? I've been slacking off myself. But yeah, no. You've got more chance of hell freezing over. Next question comes from Helix Folks, also known as the Love Muffin. Jingles, when are you going to promote yourself? It feels kind of weird being in command of the entire Salt Mines Armed Forces and only being a Commodore. I'm a Rear Admiral. Don't you watch my videos? Of course, the reason I'm a Rear Admiral is because, you know, that's... It surprise butt sex, Rear Admiral. I can't possibly promote myself. I mean, it's not a great joke, but it's the only one I've got. And as everybody keeps saying, Jingles, are you recording? Knows, if it's funny once, it's funny every time. So, moving on to the next question. This is from Yamatog2. Almighty Overlord. During the last few weeks, you've made it very clear that you love System Shock 1 and 2. I do indeed. My question is, have you ever played what is universally considered to be the spiritual successor of the System Shock series, the Bioshock series? Oh, yes. They were made by Irrational Games under the direction of Ken Levine, who was the designer and writer for System Shock 2. I have played the Bioshock games, and they're all amazing. I loved all of them, even Bioshock Infinite, which was probably the least popular. I mean, it was still really, really good, but I loved every single one of those Bioshock games because you could see the heritage all the way back to System Shock 1. And yeah, I mean, they weren't as free, if you like, as the System Shock games. There was a sort of path that you kind of mostly basically followed. The game wasn't on rails. Well, I'm talking about Bioshock Infinite here, which was a bit less... You had slightly less freedom in Bioshock Infinite. In Bioshock 1 and 2, you had a bit more freedom to go where you wanted. In System Shock, for example, which somebody was saying earlier, they're playing it and it's kicking their arse. Because as soon as you've unlocked access to various different levels on Citadel Station, you can go back to those levels anytime you want. In some cases, you have to. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but there are things on certain levels that you didn't have access to until you've been to another level and gotten that unlock, or something that you need to go back and collect in order to bring and it doesn't hold your hand at all. There's no objective markers. There's no, this is what you need to do now. You need to be paying attention. You need to be making notes from the audio logs and the messages that you find, because it doesn't tell you, you must do this. It leaves it up to you to figure it out for yourself, because games used to be hard. And System Shock is very definitely one of those. I can't wait to get the Dredge series finished so I can actually start doing the system. I mean, I love Dredge. Dredge is a great game. It's completely different to System Shock. But I've been playing System Shock and recording it, and it is kind of kicking my arse. Some of the cyberspace sequences are brutally hard, but that's just what games were like back in the 90s. So yeah, Bioshock, very, very good games. Obviously, you can trace the heritage all the way back to the System Shock games. As Yamatog 2 said, Ken Levine, the designer and writer for System Shock 2, was responsible for Bioshock. And System Shock 2, by the way, wow. I can't wait for Night Dive Studios to do what they did for System Shock 2, what they did for the original System Shock. Although there is a remake of System Shock 2, where they basically just updated the graphics. And it looks kind of janky because System Shock 2 came out when people were starting to get the first 3D graphics cards, like the early Voodoo cards and stuff. So that's why you had like Quake previously in games like Doom and the original System Shock. The environments were 3D, but the enemies were all pixelated sprites. And it wasn't until System Shock 2, or Quake came out, where they could actually do 3D enemies as well, but they were extremely low polygon enemies. I mean, you go back and you watch a video of Quake, and System Shock 2 is the same if you play the updated version. They don't look great. The environments look great, but the enemies not so much. So this is one of the things that I love about the System Shock remake by Night Dive Studios, because they've kept that kind of retro look. Everything is very faintly pixelated, but it's all properly done in 3D with the Unreal 4 engine, and it runs perfectly smoothly. I mean, there are some stutters, but it's more to do with the fact that it's the Unreal 4 engine, where the shader caches are loading in, and you get the occasional stutter. That's just Unreal 4 for you. But it runs beautifully smoothly, even on mid-range PCs. So yeah, looking forward to being able to show you more System Shock. Next question from General WCJ. Jingles, if you're in a position to do so right now, can you pay the cat tax? Actually, not right now. For those of you who don't know what the cat... Yeah, it even explains it. The cat tax is when people ask you to post a picture of your cat. If possible, can you let the people watching the recording on Mingles with Jingles see it? Because I'm probably asleep right now due to me being Pacific time at about 3 a.m. and me getting up early to post this question. I thought you were going to be able to hear Akazuki in the background, because she was being very noisy right before I started recording. It's normally the other way around. She's quiet until I start recording, then she hears me talking to somebody and she wants to get involved and comes in and starts demanding attention. But she seems to have disappeared. So you may hear her in the background at some point during the course of this question and answer session. Juzi demands just as much affection, but she's quiet about it. She'll just sit next to my chair and stand up and put her paws on my knee, which is her way of letting me know she wants to be picked up and petted. But Akazuki is very vocal about it, because Maine Coon, they are very, very vocal cats. So if you're lucky, you might hear her in the background. But at the moment, I don't know where she is. She's been very quiet. She's probably gone to sleep. Next question. Jingles, have you ever played the Homeworld series? This is from Akiaki Kiyakaha. Yes, I have. They were groundbreaking games when they came out as well. The scope and the scale. And they did something clever with the audio as well, where you would hear sort of cockpit radio chatter from the pilots and crews of the ships. That was something that I think the first game to do in a way that actually informed the gameplay was the original Half-Life. Because, I mean, Half-Life had good AI in the enemies, and I'm talking about the special forces, the human enemies. But there were other games prior to Half-Life that had good, equally good, if not possibly better AI in its enemies. But you didn't notice, because you didn't understand what it was they were doing. And Half-Life had the genius idea of allowing you to listen to their radio chatter. So you could hear them saying, he's in cover. Throw a grenade. And we're like, oh shit. They've actually worked out how to flush me out of cover. And you would hear their responses when you threw a grenade. So it's all well and good having good AI in the enemies, but if you don't communicate that AI to the player, it's often very difficult for the player to notice. And they got around that by allowing you to listen to the enemy radio chatter in Half-Life, and they did something very similar, which was immensely atmospheric in Homeworld. I played all the Homeworld games, although I haven't done the remakes. There was a fairly recent one, I think, where they did some kind of remake of Homeworld. And I think there's another Homeworld game in the pipeline as well, which I'm definitely looking forward to. But yeah, I loved the Homeworld series. The story was great, the graphics were amazing. And I'm not usually that good at real-time strategy games, and this was an even more complicated real-time strategy game because it wasn't on a 2D plane, it was in 3D space. Another game, very, very similar, was it Battlestar Galactica Deadlock? Very, very similar style of gameplay, except it was Battlestar Galactica. Another excellent game, which owed a lot, obviously, to Homeworld. If you played it, you can see the similarities straight away. Next question from Tank50US. Oh, and he says, my screen name is pronounced Tank50US. Hey! And his icon is a dragon in an M1 Abrams. Have you ever heard of the Warhammer 40,000 is entering its 10th edition on the 24th of June, and they actually managed to make sure that people who wanted their new Leviathan box set actually got them. P.S. You're part of the reason I got back into the hobby. Yeah, I still watch a lot of... like when I go to bed at night, I'll take the phone and I'll just watch YouTube videos. And a lot of the YouTube videos that I watch are people like Aeons of Battle, Vince Venturella, people who paint and talk about Warhammer models. So yes, I am absolutely aware that 10th edition is coming out. And the Leviathan box set, which is Space Marines and Tyranids. Tyranids were actually the first Warhammer 40,000 models that I had. I bought these Tyranid warriors in this vain hope that they would actually get around to producing a Tyranid army, and they never did. And then I moved on to my Imperial Guard army, which was very armour heavy, lots of tanks and stuff. But the thing is, let's see, when did I start playing Warhammer? I was in high school. It would have been 1986 or 1987, which was first edition. In fact, Rogue Trader before they did Warhammer 40,000. And I haven't really played since about 1990 when I joined the Navy. And I got back into painting and modelling, but I was just painting the models. I wasn't actually playing the games. So they keep talking about the 10th edition rules, and I don't understand any of it. And I don't need to because I don't actually play the game. I just love the models and the miniatures. Which is what, I don't know if you saw, I did a quick preview. It might have been in the last Mingles with Jingles about Warhammer Age of Sigmar, which is the kind of butchered version of what I used to know as Warhammer Fantasy Battle. But what they do in that game is they don't just design the character models and the unit models. They actually 3D scanned Age of Sigmar miniatures and then used the miniatures themselves as the basis for the units and the characters in the game. And I've got a hands-on coming up at that because there was a bunch of us got invited to a presentation, and when you saw the reveal video, which came out last week for the Age of Sigmar game, that was basically more or less what I saw. I just got to see it about 2 weeks early, but I haven't played the game, so I couldn't say whether it was good or not. I didn't know. But I'm going to be able to play it, I think, on the 24th. So in about 2 weeks, I'm actually going to get a hands-on session of playing the game, and I'll be in a much better position to let you know what it's about. There's going to be some kind of embargo on it, so I won't be talking about it in 2 weeks. I'll probably have to wait another week or so after that before I can do anything, but I'm definitely going to have a go with it. Next question from Bearcat Racing. Hi Jingles, I hope you know I'm missing my over 80s new lawn bowls competition for this. Serious question. If you were the first person to land on Mars, what would be your first words that will go down in history? Also, did you know Uranus has rings? Yes, yeah. I can't remember how long ago it was they discovered Uranus has rings, but they're barely visible, but it does have them. Also, it says stay strong, Eddie. So if I were to land on Mars, because of course, I wasn't alive when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. That was 1969. I was born in 1970. But I saw the first shuttle launches live on TV. But the first person to land on Mars, obviously I'd take a flag, and I'd claim it for the salt mines. I don't know. I mean, I suppose that would probably... I realise you're probably expecting me to come up with something really, really funny, but I usually have to think about it for a while first. Actually, what is there to mine on Mars? Because the Martian soil is basically poisonous. It's full of, is it hydrogen percolate, which is highly toxic. You spend 3 months on Mars, you'd get the equivalent dose of radiation that NASA astronauts get in their entire careers. It's freezing. Generating power is going to be a nightmare because you only get 40% of the solar power on Mars that you get from Earth, and then sometimes the dust storms can drop that down by 50% for days at a time. So you'd probably have to take nukes, which would require fuel, which you're probably not going to mine the uranium or plutonium there yourself. I mean, I'm excited that we are going to Mars, but it's not going to be easy. If you think about it, like the structures would have to be circular, because if you build anything with a corner in it, that's a point of failure, because they'd have to be pressurized, and the atmospheric pressure on Mars is too low to even support surface water. So you wouldn't have any windows because, radiation. You'd probably be buried under ice and dirt, and even that wouldn't stop all the radiation, but it would stop enough. You'd have to grow your own food, and to do that you'd first have to sterilize the soil of all the poison in it and then fertilize it with your own shit. You'd be basically stuck inside this. It'd be worse than being on a submarine for 6 months. And the thing is, there'd be no shortage of volunteers for it either. People are crazy, but getting off this planet so that we're a multi-planet species is an absolute necessity, because just look at the events of the last couple of years. Bad things can happen here, and we don't want to be keeping all of our eggs in one basket. So establishing a colony on Mars is probably the most important thing that we can do as a species, but it is not going to be easy. I mean, Mars doesn't even have a magnetic field. So, because the surface, the core isn't molten the way that Earth's is, and molten and spinning. So there's no magnetic field to absorb any of that solar radiation. So Martian colonists are basically going to have to live underground. It's going to be horrible, but it's going to be absolutely necessary. Anyway, next question, moving on from K. Jager. Are you recording? I am. Have you seen the class action lawsuit against Steam in the US? They say they're price fixing and we're forcing a monopoly on their customers and developers. I haven't seen that, although I'm not surprised. Not that I'm not... I've just heard of it, so I don't really have an opinion. So don't take anything that I say here as gospel. But I'm not surprised that people are accusing Steam of price fixing and being a monopoly. Because, if anybody can sue somebody with just look at what Epic tried to do with Apple. And technically, I suppose Apple, it absolutely does have a monopoly on products on the Apple platform, which you sign a user agreement for. Because Epic tried to get around it I'm sure most of you are... I've definitely talked about an episode of Mingles with Jingles before, but Epic basically... I think they tried to engineer a situation where they could sue Apple in order to try to break Apple's monopoly on iOS, which succeeded in forcing the lawsuit, but they haven't had the result that they wanted. I'm going to have to look into this. Class action lawsuit against Steam. It's not like stuff on Steam's expensive. The price fixing? Really? Yeah, well, I'd love to be able to comment more on that, but literally, you asking me about it is the first I've heard of it, so I can't really say much more than that, sorry. But that sounds like something I should be looking into. Next question from Minotree93. Dear Overlord Jingles, you're sitting down with your parents and you're forced to answer one of the following questions in full to them. Which would it be? VTubers, furries, or internet memes from the past decade? So I'm assuming you're asking I have to explain one of these things to them. P.S. It's 5 a.m. here in Texas. My bed is calling. Well, I hope I got to you early enough. We're only 20 minutes in. VTubers. I don't think... Do VTubers really need explaining that much? Because I don't really watch VTubers, although I used to. There's a guy called Philip something, who I used to watch years and years and years ago. Philip DeFranco, that was it, I think. I've probably got his name wrong. and I used to watch him regularly. He actually came over to Europe to do a tour, and he kind of experienced what I experienced that time I went to the Tank Museum. Got 10 feet inside, somebody shouted Jingles, and I was there shaking hands for the next 5 hours. He organised a meet with fans in Hyde Park in London, and like 250 people turned up, and it was kind of scary, also kind of dangerous, because there was no crowd control. He anticipated maybe there being 15 to 20 people, and 10 times that amount turned up. But I don't really watch VTubers anymore, so I'm not aware of any weird shit to do with VTubers that would need to be explained. I'm not touching furries with a 10-foot long stick, certainly not to my parents. I'd probably go on internet memes from the past decade because, my parents are boomers. I'm Generation X. Have you noticed nobody gives Generation X any shit? The boomers get shit. The millennials and the Gen Zs all get shit, but everybody leaves Generation X alone. Have you noticed that? You know why? Because we'll fuck you up. We're the last generation of kids that were basically feral, right? Our parents didn't know where we were most of the time because we'd get thrown out to play in the streets, and we wouldn't be let in until it was dinner time. In America, they actually used to have this commercial that would come on at 10 o'clock at night saying, just to remind people that they actually had children, it would say, do you know where your children are? 10 o'clock at night in the US in the 70s. We were we're the last tough generation. You fuck with the Gen X and, you fuck around, you'll find out. That's why people don't give Gen X shit. We kind of dodged a bullet there, of course, because the boomers you wouldn't want... That's the thing, though. People give the boomers shit. The boomers aren't even aware that they're getting shit because they're completely internet illiterate. So you're completely wasting your time. But yes, probably internet memes from the past decade, because it'd be funny explaining them to my parents because they wouldn't have the faintest idea what they were. Anyway, KV2 Strong says, greetings, most salty overlord. First and foremost, best wishes for you and Eddie. Thank you very much. Hope he responds really well to his camo. Yeah, we all do. I've been holding on to this for a while, but since people seem to enjoy your stories, precisely 10 years and 8 days ago in Mingles with Jingles episode 8. Holy shit, is it that long? You mentioned the story of your father's escapades and what he left you. I don't believe you've retold it since. Would you like to recount it? P.S. Thanks for the book recommendation last Q&A from a fellow fan of Bill Slim. Oh, yeah, the Uncle Bill, his biography. Fantastic book. So, yeah, my father... who I can barely remember what he looks like. So, how can I put this? He probably wasn't a particularly nice person, and I think that was because he was just young. And, it's easy to be an arsehole and an idiot when you're young until you learn better. But he was in the parachute regiment, and he got my mother pregnant, and then they got married, and then they had me, and then 2 years later they had my sister Wendy. And then he left my mother. I don't think he even bothered divorcing her, he just left her. Still in the parachute regiment, but apparently he then got kicked out of the army for assaulting a superior officer. Like I said, bit of an arsehole. And he shacked up with some other woman. And then he joined, and I'm not making this up, the French Foreign Legion. Yes, really. So when I was 12 in 1982, and my mother and stepfather were taking the family to South Africa because my stepfather was a fitter and turner, but he was a union man. And they were really starting to crack down on the power of the unions in this country in the early 80s, and basically he got blacklisted because he was a union shop steward and nobody would employ him. So he'd been unemployed for 2 years and then got an offer of work in South Africa, so he emigrated to South Africa. The problem was they couldn't take myself and my sister out of the country without his permission. So they had to track down his new wife, who he'd also abandoned apparently, and that's when we found out that he was in the French Foreign Legion and somewhere in Algeria, I think, at the time. And it was 2 years later when we'd moved to Swaziland from South Africa that we got the news that he'd actually been killed. And the French government, they didn't go into the details, but he'd been killed on active service somewhere in North Africa. So given the history of North Africa and French colonies in North Africa at the time, probably Algeria. And I think the last time I ever saw him alive, I was being looked after by my grandmother because my mother was working 2 jobs as a single mother to support her 2 kids. And he just turned up on my 7th birthday. And you can imagine how popular he was with my grandmother, right? Not very. So I saw him for like 10 minutes before she threw him out, and he brought me a racing car set. And that was, I think, the second time I'd seen him since he left my mother when I was 4 years old. So, I mean, I didn't know the man. By all accounts, he was a bit of an arsehole and a bit of a nutcase. And that's the story of my father. So there you go. Thanks for asking, and I hope you all enjoyed that one. Next question from Did Nothing To. Are you recording? Yeah, I hope so. I can see the recording icon, and there's a little microphone icon next to it, so it's probably recording sound too. I guess we'll see afterwards. Dale Lira, trying his luck for the 5th month in a row. Congratulations, you got your question answered. Dear Mighty Overlord Bohemian Eagle, greetings from Israel. I'm very saddened to hear about Uncle Eddie. Lots of love to you and him. Thank you. Questions. He's got 2 questions here. What do you think about the marketing term military grade? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to answer this question before I move on, before I even look at the second question. Because you do see this stuff like military grade combat knife or military grade radio. And you have to understand, everything in the military is built by the lowest bidder, right? It doesn't mean it's good. It means it's cheap, right? And I do laugh every time I see something advertised as military grade. It's like you see stuff advertised as being surgical steel as well. There's no such thing as surgical steel. It's a marketing term made up by the advertisers. Whereas there is such a thing as military grade, and it usually means the cheapest thing that's barely suitable for purpose. So generally you want to stay away from anything that's advertised as being military grade, because you can find something better. Like, for example, when the British troops were going out to the Second Gulf War and to Afghanistan, they would go to military surplus shops and buy their own webbing and kit, because it was just like the Black Hawk stuff and the 511 tactical stuff was just so much better than the shit they were getting issued, because everything made by the military is made by the lowest bidder. He says, as a fellow military veteran, does it amuse you as well how much it is used positively as a selling point? Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the funniest things I've ever heard. But military grade is definitely not what you should be buying if you have the choice. Second question, do you ever think of giving away old gear, consoles, PCs, kits, memorabilia, etc., to the less fortunate miners? I do give away, because this was a question that was raised by, because I employ an accountant, because most people in the UK don't have to do their own taxes. It's all, the tax is taken out of your pay before, by your employer, before you get paid. So anything you get paid is yours. You're never going to get taxed on it. You've already been taxed on it. But because I'm technically self-employed, I have to do my own taxes. So I just pay an accountant £250 once a year to do it for me. And they did say, so what happened to the old PC? Did you sell it? Because, that's something that needs to be... And no, I don't. I give them away. I do give them away anyway. Eddie's usually the beneficiary. But sometimes Eddie knows people who have got like a 7-year-old laptop and could use a new PC. So anytime I upgrade, and I haven't actually upgraded in a couple of years, but anytime I upgrade my PC, I give it to somebody who needs it. My friend Roy, he got one of my PCs, he's still using it actually, he's upgraded the processor. No, still got the same processor. This is about a 4-year-old PC. He's put a new graphics card in it, and he's using it as a server. So I do give them away. In fact, my Nintendo Switch handheld, which I haven't used in about a year and a half, I've just gave that to Eddie while he's in hospital. So yeah, I do give my stuff away. But as a... I mean, I don't deliberately do it in order to avoid paying taxes. It's just a handy, happy coincidence. Anyway, next question from that something Japanese. It's even in Japanese characters, so I wouldn't even be able to guess how to pronounce it. But he says, "Hello, Jingles. You can call me Wolf." Okay, Wolf. Thank you. My question is, would you have stayed in the Navy, have the opportunity to become a captain or a high rank, maybe an admiral even? Also, what type of ship would you choose to be in command of if you had the option? There was absolutely no chance of me ever becoming a captain. I wasn't an officer. I wasn't an officer candidate In fact, the highest rank I ever achieved in the Navy after 22 years was leading rate, which is like the equivalent of corporal. Because I basically didn't want to be promoted above my level of competence, which is all too often the case in any kind of bureaucracy. Although the Navy does a fairly good job, they never used to, but they certainly at the time where I was in, they started doing a much, much better job of picking who should and shouldn't get promoted. See, the way it used to work was they would have this points system. And every year you get your annual report, and your report would give you a certain number of points based on a number of different categories. And like leadership was only one of those categories, and it wasn't even the most important one. Because what a lot of people fail to understand was that a promotion report shouldn't care how good you are in the job that you're doing, because you wouldn't be doing that job after being promoted. So it should assess how well you're expected to be able to do in the next highest rank, but it never used to do that. And the point system meant that whoever had the most points in whichever branch or category was going to be the next one selected for promotion. So if they had like 20 vacancies for leading radio operators, then of the thousands of able rating radio operators, whichever 20 had the most points would be selected to be promoted to leading radio operator. Now, the problem with the point system was if you were the best radio operator in the world, the most you could expect to get, the most it was physically possible to get from your first promotion report was 100 points. And if you were the worst radio operator in the world and you'd been sitting in that rank for 10 years getting 30 points, which is shit, every year, you would have more points. So you would get picked. You'd automatically get selected for promotion and sent on a qualifying course and so on and so on. When you were terrible at the job and going to be even worse as a leading radio operator. Whereas, you know, the youngsters who were shit hot wouldn't stand a chance of getting promoted because of all of the duffers who'd been sitting in the same rank for 10 years, slowly accumulating points. So it was a terrible system. And halfway through my career in the Navy, they changed it so that they would put much, much more emphasis on how you were anticipated to be able to perform in the next highest rank. There was much more emphasis on leadership. There was very little credence given to how good you were as an able rating, because it's assumed that, you know, unless you're shit and going to get kicked out for being shit, then everybody's going to be doing a good job in their current rank. They were more concerned with how you would be expected to perform in the next highest rank, which was the whole point. So there was a lot less of people being promoted above their level of competence, certainly in the last 10 years I was in the Navy, compared to the first 12, where it was just terrible and the system badly needed changing. But there was no chance of me ever becoming a captain. I mean, for a start, you had to get promoted. If you get promoted through the ranks, you would have to usually at least have attained the rank of petty officer, but mostly chief petty officer. Although if you'd been identified as a suitable officer candidate, you would get fast-tracked, but you still had to pass the same qualifications as everybody else who was going to get promoted to petty officer or chief petty officer. They just expected you to be able to handle it because they decided that, you know, you clearly had the potential. But you had to work really, really hard. But I never made it to petty officer. I never made it to chief petty officer. I know I talk like a chief petty officer. That's just because I'm old. But the highest rank I made it to was leading radio operator because I was... Oh, not radio operator, because I've changed branches to writer, leading writer. Because I was a good writer. I was a very, very good writer. I was an okay leading writer. I wasn't as good a leader. I freely acknowledge that. And I would have been a terrible petty officer writer. So I was quite happy. I mean, I was qualified for it. And at one point I got selected for it, but I turned it down. Because I just knew I would have been shit and I wouldn't have enjoyed it. Because I like being good at what I do. And I didn't want to be promoted to a rank where I wouldn't. I knew I wouldn't have been good at what I did. So there you go. Right, where are we? Godot says, Dear Jingles, first of all, yes, I'm recording. Like I said, if it's funny once, it's funny every time. What would you consider to be the biggest bruh moment in history? In other words, what would you believe was peak stupid or incompetence so far? Oh, God, I don't know. Are we allowed to get political? Probably not. I don't know. peak stupid or incompetence. I suppose, I don't know, Bismarck thinking that the system of alliances and... there was a word for it. It was the First World War, basically. Blackadder summed this up. I don't know if you've ever seen Blackadder Goes Forth, when they were asking about why the First World War happened, and he's explaining it to Lieutenant George and Baldrick. And he says, well, the First World War happened because there was a huge... I mean, everybody was so massively armed. People had been building up their armies and their navies. And there were this system of alliances where if you were to attack one member of the alliance, then everybody else in the alliance would declare war on you and blah this, and then all of the members of your alliance would declare war, and it would lead to such a massive outbreak of hostilities that nobody could possibly win. And this whole system, which was kind of Otto von Bismarck, there was a name for the system, I can't remember, but he kind of engineered it all. That the idea of actually going to war was unthinkable. The problem with the plan was that it was complete and utter bollocks. and of course then the First World War happened when one Archduke got shot in Serbia. I don't know. I mean, I suppose if I had more time I could think of a much, much better and more amusing moment than that. But, you know, if you're watching this episode of Mingles with Jingles, as an episode of Mingles with Jingles on Monday, if you can think of something, let's hear it in the comments, because I'm sure that, given a bit of time, you could probably come up with something better than that. But yeah, the First World War was probably, because this was a war that just didn't need to happen. It was just a complete waste of lives, resources, time, everything. The war never needed to happen. But it kind of became inevitable that it was going to happen, just because of the way the political systems were set up. Next question from David L. Hi Jingles, sorry to hear about Eddie, best wishes to you both. Thanks Dave. Would you consider taking a look at Nebula's Fleet Command? It's a space combat game with an Expanse aesthetic. Ooh, really? And a semi-modern naval combat paradigm, sensors, electronic warfare, missiles, point defences and guns. See, I've heard of the game, but I've never actually looked at it. But you kind of had me at Expanse. Oh, there's an Expanse game coming out, by the way. I think it's... I don't know if Telltale Games are still around. I heard they went bankrupt, but it's either made by the people who worked at Telltale, or it is still Telltale and they haven't gone bankrupt, or it's just heavily inspired by their games. And I looked at a trailer for it, and I mean, there was a time when you could put the Star Wars logo on a piece of shit on a shingle and I would have bought it just because it had Star Wars on it. But I've gotten a bit more discriminatory now. And just saying that this is an Expanse game is no longer enough, because I love The Expanse. Read all the books, watched the TV show, loved both. But just saying it's kind of like The Expanse, or it is The Expanse, is no longer enough for me to just go ahead and buy it. And I was watching, there was this, so I don't know if you've seen it, but there's this Expanse game. Sorry to get off the subject of Nebula's Fleet Command. I will look into that. Thank you for the thing. But I just wanted to talk about this actual Expanse game that's coming out very, very soon, apparently, where you play Kamina Drummer. I'm not going to go into the details of explaining who she was. If you know her, you know her. If you don't, it doesn't matter. And you're salvaging a wreck of a frigate or a cruiser or whatever. And one of your crew, as you're at the door of the vault of which is, you're basically completely exposed to space. I mean, the half of the side of the ship is gone. It's just vacuum. But you're trying to get into this vault, and one of your crew gets their foot stuck or caught, and you have to choose between saving the crewman or jettisoning the vault and losing the contents. Why do you have to choose, was the question I was asking. Because you're salvaging a wreck of a ship that's basically drifting through space. And if you jettison the vault, it becomes a vault that's just drifting through space. How is that a problem? I mean, you're in a ship. Ships can move. You had to move to the wreck in order to start the salvage process in the first place. If you jettison the vault, just move to the vault and restart the salvage process. I don't see why you need to make a choice. Because Telltale games are all about making these kind of choices, and those choices having consequences. But I'm sitting there thinking, I don't see the issue here. Just cut the crewman free, jettison the vault so you can cut the crewman free, save his life, and then go and get the vault. But apparently this is a big... So I like this kind of game, but the decisions have to make sense. And this one absolutely didn't. And it was kind of ironic that this was the decision that they chose to showcase as this is what the game's going to be like, which was, yeah, bad example, guys. I hope the rest of the game's not going to be like that. Anyway, moving on to NEP. But anyway, yeah, Dave, Nebulous Fleet Command, I will take a look at that. Because the space I mean, it wasn't the best thing in the Expanse. Everything about the Expanse was amazing. But the space combat, I don't know if you noticed, by the way, I'm sorry to keep going on about this. You know the PDCs, the point defense cannons, that the Rocinante had to shoot down incoming torpedoes? This was never something that they pointed out. It was never anything that they dwelled on and made a big deal of, but it's just one of those little examples in the Expanse TV show of how seriously they took it and how they really took care of the details. Because it's a point defense cannon. It's firing, I don't know, tungsten or depleted uranium slugs at a stupid rate of fire. So it's generating a lot of recoil. And if you've got 4 of these things around the various different axes of the ship, every time they fire, they're going to start spinning the ship around because they generate recoil. But if you look at the point defense guns, the PDCs, when they're firing, at the back of the PDC, every time the gun fires, there's a retro rocket fires to counteract the recoil. And it's you probably never noticed it, but it's there because they took this shit seriously. And it's one of the reasons why The Expanse is such a good show. Anyway, next question from NEP. Glorious Gnome Overlord, this not-so-humble Californian Yank wishes to ask the following 4 questions. Ooh, is your microwave recording? Right, okay. He will not be held responsible if is your insert random household appliance or electronic device here recording becomes the next evolution of the running joke. I hate you. Second question, if you were to find yourself in the United States for a week or 2, what would you find yourself doing? Which museums would you visit, like Plains of Fame in Chino, California? I'd love to do the battleship tours, the carrier tours, because I visited HMS Intrepid in New York, and that's incredible, because it's not just a carrier, it's a space museum as well, because they've got, I think, is it the Enterprise? They've got the shuttle that never actually flew, the one that, never went into orbit. It was the one that was carried on the back of the modified 747 to test its gliding capabilities. I think it was the Enterprise, because they've got pictures of like George Takei and Nichelle Nichols and James Doohan and Leonard Nimoy at the exhibit when they first unveiled it. So I think it probably was the Enterprise, but they've got that on the back of the flight deck. They've got all kinds of aircraft on the flight deck. And of course, the Intrepid was also used to recover some of the splashdowns from the space missions. So they've got like Gemini capsules, the ones they actually recovered inside the hangar bay, all kinds of air and space displays. The Intrepid's fantastic, and it's right there in New York. It's one of the most accessible aerospace and naval museums around. But I'd love to visit like the New Jersey or, oh God, what's that? There's a carrier down in Corpus Christi in Texas and so on and so on. All of these things, because they've got more of this stuff than anywhere else in the world. Battleship Texas as well, for example. It's probably just getting around, because America's a big place. And of course, I don't drive, so it would be difficult. So I'd need to visit places that had easy access to airports to fly around domestically within the US, and airports that were in convenient distance of any of these big, museums. But you could spend, a couple of weeks, you could spend months going around the US and still not see everything. Third question, would you be willing to accept model recommendations for Workshop Wednesdays when that eventually returns? I really do need to do something about that, don't I? But yeah, I'd be happy to accept model recommendations. But I'm definitely going to want to get to work on the pile of shame first. I've got all kinds of things that need doing that I'm just not doing because I haven't actually picked up the airbrush in a while. My friend James Brooksby, who was the CEO of Edge Case Games, the guys that did Fractured Space and Strike Suit Zero, working on a new game now, by the way, new company. Because Wargaming bought out Edge Case Games, they're now Wargaming Guildford, and they kept all of the staff. But then they brought in other people and kind of sidelined James, so he basically was left with nothing to do. And he wants to make games. It's what makes him happy, so he left. Because they didn't sack him, but they did kind of force him out. So they're working on a new game now. But he did some 3D printing, and I've got a bust of the Mandalorian, which I think is the only thing I've painted this year. So I really do need to get back into that. His final question: what are your thoughts as a Royal Navy veteran on the still ongoing issue with the carrier HMS Prince of Wales and its faulty propeller shaft? Well, what can I say? It's military grade, isn't it? It's designed and built by the lowest bidder. Yeah, I mean, there's very, very little that gets accepted for military service that works perfectly the first time around. I mean, look at the M16 as an infamous example. I mean, the M16 wasn't even that bad when it was first introduced. It was just that the US Army, trying to get everything done on the cheap, wanted to use their existing stocks of ammunition. And the powder in that ammo wasn't as smokeless as it could be. I mean, there were all kinds of reasons why the M16 was a disaster when it was first introduced, but the old ammo that they were issued with at first was one of the issues. Also, it was advertised as a self-cleaning rifle, so you didn't need to maintain it as much as they had to maintain their M14s and their M1s prior to that, which was bollocks, particularly if you're not using the right ammunition. But that's evolved into arguably the finest weapons platform in the world. So, there's, like I said, there are very, very little military items that work flawlessly when they're first introduced. In fact, can anybody think, aside from maybe the K-bar knife, any military item that worked perfectly the second it was introduced into service? Because I cannot think of one. So if you guys can think of one, by all means, go for it, because I'm drawing a blank here. Anyway, how are we doing for time? Right. We're coming up to 47 minutes long. I'm going to have to start knocking this one on the head. And I'm looking at the next question. Yang Wen Li, I really, really am sorry here. You were about to get your question answered, but there's an entire paragraph of 4 questions here, which will probably take me 20 minutes to answer. So I'm going to skip through, I'm really sorry, until I see a question that I can answer quickly, and we'll make this the last one. Oh, here's one from Silex69. Greetings, Mighty Overlord. My father served in the Navy in World War II. He always came out with Navy phrases that caused much confusion until explained, such as goffers, meaning fizzy drink. Anything like this still in your common use? Yeah, that's true. Any specialist group will always tend to have their own language, if you like, phrases and terms that they use that you just don't understand unless you're in that group. Like if you're playing World of Warcraft, just as one example, and you see somebody in trade chat and they're saying LF1M OS2D 10 H Pala. What the fuck does that mean? It means they're looking for one more for the Obsidian Sanctum, 2 Drakes, 10-man mode, they want a Holy Paladin. But if you hadn't been playing, if you weren't in the know, you wouldn't understand anything that anybody was saying in trade chat or they're looking for group channels. Because people develop their own terminology, and the Navy's the same. A goffer is a fizzy drink, but it's also a wave. But it's only a wave if it hits you. Because if you get goffered, it means you were on the quarterdeck having a cigarette and a wave came in and drenched you. Right, so it's a fizzy drink and it's a wave, but not when it's out at ocean, only when it comes overboard and hits you. And there's all kinds of terms. In fact, there's an entire book called Jack Speak, and it's not a small book. It's like 1 inch thick, and it's just a naval dictionary, an A to Z, and there's all kinds of stuff in there. Like we had special terms for the ship's chaplain, for example, the sky pilot, the god botherer. But what do I still use? Gash. Gash is a word that I often use. This actually comes from Plymouth, because a lot of these naval terms, they come from the vernacular of the towns where there were naval bases. So down in Plymouth, in Her Majesty's Naval Base, Devonport, there's a lot of Plymouth terms that have crept into the Navy. For example, gash. Gash is rubbish, and a gash bag is a bin bag. So I still refer to bin bags as gash bags. Oh, here's one for you. The Navy's nickname for Plymouth is Guz. Right? We don't say Plymouth. We say we're off to Guz. We'll go. Wow, I've forgotten how to speak English there. The ship's going into Guz for the weekend. That one actually, because you've got these radio call signs. Obviously, military vessels have their own military call signs, but every ship in the world has what's known as an international radio call sign, and they're 4-figure call signs. And it's not just ships that have them. Anything that communicates with ships, so like the Harbour Master's Tower in Plymouth, also has its own international radio call sign. And British international radio call signs start with the letter G, or Golf. So, for example, my first ship, HMS Brazen, was Golf Zulu India Tango, Gizzit, which, by the way, is another naval phrase. A gizzit is a present. It comes from, it's an abbreviation of the phrase, give us it, or just gizzit. So you go out ashore when you're visiting somewhere on deployment to buy some gizzits to take home to give to your family. And my first ship, HMS Brazen, its call sign was Golf Zulu India Tango, or Gizzit. But the reason Plymouth is called Guz is because the Harbour Master's Tower, on the approach into Plymouth, its international radio call sign is Golf Uniform Zulu Zulu, Guz. And so that's why the Navy calls Plymouth Guz. And that then crept into the local Plymouth vernacular, so that people from Plymouth call Plymouth Guz as well, rather than Plymouth. So it kind of works both ways. What was the question? Oh yes, anything like this still in common use? Yes, gash bag. I go for Adobe, for a wash, for a shower. It's Adobe rather than a wash or a shower. And that comes from the Empire, specifically India, where the army in India would employ locals to do their laundry, and they would be called the Dobi Walla, which was a sort of a bastardization of the Indian term for a laundryman. So having your Dobi was getting your washing done. So there's all kinds of things like this that we still use, and a lot of people in the Navy don't even know where they come from. Like the British expression, cold enough to freeze the balls off a brass monkey. Where the hell does that one come from? It comes from the days of sail, when cannonballs were made of iron, and there'd be these brass plates on the deck of the sailing ships. You've probably seen them, when the cannonballs were all stacked up in a little pyramid. They were stacked up in a brass plate that had sort of impressions in them to hold the cannonballs, and then you'd stack them up. But because of the thermal properties of iron compared to brass, brass, when it gets cold, shrinks faster than iron does. So if it got really, really cold, the brass plate, or the brass monkey, which is what it was called, don't know why, would shrink faster than the iron cannonballs on the brass monkey. So they would pop out of the divots in the brass plate, because it was cold enough to freeze the balls off a brass monkey. So it's anyway, that's going to have to be it. We're definitely we're at over 50 minutes now, so that's going to be it for this week's episode. Thank you to everybody who turned up. My apologies to everybody who didn't get their question answered, particularly Yang Wen Lee, because you managed to cram 4 questions in there, and it would probably take me another 20 minutes to answer them. So sorry about that. And thank you to everybody who did turn up. Thank you to everybody who posted a question. Congratulations to everybody who got a question answered. And if you're watching this as your Monday episode of Mingles with Jingles, take care